part of me is like, man, why don't you have a whole lot to say about this episode? And the other part is like, well, you chose this episode to do for your holiday videos because the villain is a giant snowflake. It's like, yeah, I knew what I was getting into. Star Trek The Next Generation Silicone Avatar is the return of the Crystalline Entity, which we first saw in the first season episode that delved into Data's backstory, introduced his evil twin brother Lore, and saw the Crystalline Entity come and try to destroy the ship until Lore was able to communicate with it and get it to go away. This episode starts off colonizing a new planet, and then the Crystalline Entity returns and starts laying waste to the colonists down there until Riker is able to lead them all into some caves that protect them until the Enterprise is able to come back and pick them all up. This leads to a scientist coming on board who has dedicated her life to studying the Crystalline Entity because it murdered her son on that colony. And this leads to a lot of continuity errors, problems, considering that I very recently watched the previous episode with the Crystalline Entity. Maybe it was less of a concern back in the 80s, early 90s when this show was coming out, and it had been a 4-year gap between these episodes. But it's like, what do you mean you dedicated your life to studying this? No offense, lady, you're not young, and this entity was first discovered 4 years ago. So you did not dedicate your life to studying it. Yes, it murdered the colonists like 20 plus years ago, but nobody knew that's what happened until the Enterprise found it 4 years ago. That was the whole plot of that episode. They were like, oh, we'll go back here and see if we can find any clues to what happened to these colonists, and then they found all these drawings of a weird crystal thing in the sky from kids on the colony, and it was like, oh, what are these? And then there was a big crystalline entity, and then Lore communicated with it to get it to go away, which is another continuity issue in this episode where there's a whole plot thread in the middle where they're like, are we able to communicate with this thing? It's like, yes, you know that you are. You might not know how, but you know for a fact that Lore did. You even say in this episode that Lore lured it to the colony, and that's the first colony from that first episode. So in order to lure something, you have to find some way of communicating with it. So, like, even when you're fishing, we're not talking to fish like Aquaman or something, but we're still like, clearly have a lure, a means of getting the fish to do what we want. And if what you want is for this big crystalline entity to leave your planets alone, well, a lore and there's clearly a way to do it. You know for a fact. So, whatever. Some continuity issues aside, this episode was a pretty decent exploration of grief as this scientist character, her son, died on the first colony that this crystalline entity attacked. So she's, it's been 20 years, but the loss of a son isn't something you fully get over. At the beginning of the episode, she blames Data and doesn't trust him because his identical twin brother, but, designed fairly similarly, Lore, was the one that led the crystalline entity there to kill her son. So the relationship between this scientist character and Data is very interesting to explore throughout the episode as she goes from hating him and distrusting him and barely being able to speak to him to working with him and eventually forgiving him. And then from there, because it has been said a couple times that Data has some of the memories and knowledge and logs of all of those colonists as part of his core program, she asks to access the information that he has on her son. So then he becomes her one link to her son who died at the age of 16. So it's an interesting, where's the line there between, oh, this is healing and kind of nice, to this is stopping your ability to heal and grieve and move on. I don't know what that line is, and I kind of wish this episode had a scene or two with Counselor Troy. Maybe even if the doctor, the scientist, didn't go to Troy to talk to her about that, maybe, you know, after the first scene where the scientist asks Data to speak in her son's voice, maybe Data after that could have gone to Troy and been like, you know, this is a complicated situation with human emotions that I need your help in grappling with. I think that would have been an interesting addition to this episode. Overall, this episode was fine. I was, you know, I hadn't really remembered much of what happened with it other than big snowflake enemy, which is why I watched it. It's not one of the best episodes of The Next Generation. It's certainly not one of the worst. It's a fine episode of The Next Generation that tackles grief in an interesting way, even if I'm not 100% happy with how the scientist character ends up at the end of the movie. But that's not really, I'm fine with what happened. It just felt a little predictable. And those are my thoughts on The Next Generation Silicone Avatar, which I literally only watched because holiday time, big snowflake villain, winter, you get it. Star Trek hasn't really done any holiday episodes since the original series did a Halloween episode, which I did talk about during Halloween. So if you want to check out some Halloween Star Trek episodes, the link is around. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, and have a good week.